Right. We're all here, and I think we're at just gone 10:30, so let's be on time, as on time as we can be. Good morning, folks, and first of all, thank you for joining us in this session this morning. I believe there's another session happening at this time, which is also extremely popular, so we're really grateful to you for joining this one, which is such a pertinent and interesting topic, I think, rail reopenings. My name's Michael Solomon Williams. I'm Head of Campaigns and External Affairs at Campaign for Better Transport. For those of you who don't know about our work, we've been around for just over half a century. We were founded 53 years ago as Transport 2000 in those days by rail workers in response to what was the Beeching cuts and then the prospect of further cuts to the network. So rail connectivity, particularly intercity, but also particularly at the local level, as we'll discuss today, is really a part of our DNA. So it's a great pleasure to be here and presenting on this topic. I should also say it's Rail Safety Week this week. It's also Better Transport Week. What is that? That is celebrating all that matters about transport connectivity, including rail, light rail, bus, active travel, shared mobility. It's a really big thing now. It's been going for 4 years. We've got partners from across the industry. We have support from governments. We have support from industry partners. And it's a really brilliant week. There are ways you can get involved as organisations and as individuals. We have events around the country. There are also things like competitions and all sorts of levels of ways to engage. So if you're not already engaged in Better Transport Week, then please do so. As part of that week, I'm actually spending the week myself very much engaged with this particular topic, which is to say that I'm visiting lines that have been reopened recently or are looking at reopening or are definitely going to reopen. It's a bit of a mad kind of whistle-stop tour around the country involving more or less 2 lines a day. I started on Monday morning in the West Midlands going to the Camp Hill line, which reopened just in April. Monday afternoon went to quite the opposite, to Curzon Street to look at HS2, but it was great in terms of contrast between the most granular and local and the sort of biggest infrastructure project that's happening in terms of a new line. And then Tuesday morning went on the Settle Carlisle line in its 150th anniversary. Sure, not a reopening, if you like. It's a bit of a tenuous link, but it's a line that we were involved in saving in the 1980s, and of course that's been a storming success ever since. And then in the afternoon went across via Carlisle to the Northumberland line, and saw the Northumberland line in action, and it's extraordinary to see the growth of success of that line just over the last year since I was last there. Outstanding success. Wednesday morning I went down to the Core Valleys, to the Treherbert line in the Core Valleys. Wednesday afternoon over to the Portishead line and Ashley Down Station to see what's happening in the west of England, which is absolutely fantastic. Just talking about Brabazon as well, which we'll hear more about today, I'm sure. Thursday morning is now. Thursday afternoon, going down with Matt. Actually, we'll be down looking at the Dartmoor line. I can't wait to get down there because I have to say, in the work that we do making the case for rail reopenings, the Dartmoor line is an absolute pin-up. So I'm really excited to get to Dartmoor and Oakhampton Station in particular and see how that's really not depended upon, but been really driven by the community in a really incredible way. And then that's it for my kind of mad dash around the 4 corners of England and Wales. We've got a conference in London on Friday, which Peter Hendy is also speaking at, the Rail Minister. So if you're around London and would like to join us at that conference, you're very, very welcome to do so. That's it for CBT and for what we're doing this week. The topic, I'll just give a very brief introduction to the topic, you know what we're talking about today. And then what we'll do is go around and each of the members of our esteemed panel are going to give a bit of an introduction to themselves, a few minutes just talking about themselves, their role, and what they do in relation to rail reopenings. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion. We've got some guiding questions. We'll have the panel discussion. And then if we've got a bit of time, we'll open up to the floor. Okay? So, railway reopenings, what is required to get a business case approved? What do we need to get a reopening project over the line? Which non-railway impacts need to be considered, and what are the hoops that those behind the schemes and behind the scenes of those schemes have to jump through to get them to work? So we'll go down, if we start at the far end and work our way down here. So delighted, by the way, to introduce our esteemed panel, starting here, and then we'll introduce ourselves from here. We have Neil Blagburn, who's Programme Delivery Director at AECOM. We're in a different order, it's fine. We've got Matt Barnes, who's Head of Strategic Service Development at Great Western Railways. We have Ben McMain, who is Rail Infrastructure Programme Manager at North East Combined Authority. And we have Neil Blagburn, Programme Delivery Director at AECOM. So great to have you all. If we could start, Neil, if you'd like to introduce yourself and give us a few minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for attending and snubbing Pete Andy. That's great. I've been involved with railway projects for 23 years and career spanning back in the railway for longer than that. Started as an apprentice traction fitter on rolling stock. But really, last 23 years in projects, in the last 15 in major programme delivery. Recently led the Northumberland line has already been introduced. Reintroduction of passenger train services between Ashington and Newcastle for the first time in 60 years. We'll go on about the successes of that. And currently sharing as many of the lessons from Northumberland as possible with as many people as are prepared to listen. And that is really important that we do that as an industry, amongst other things.
Thanks, Neil.
Brilliant. So, hi everyone. I'm Ben McMain, Rail Infrastructure Programme Manager at the North East Mayoral Strategic Authority, recently rebranded from our North East Combined Authority, very much bringing us in line with some of the new government legislation around devolved mayoral bodies. So very much the new kid on the block in terms of getting ourselves involved in the development of real business cases, but also more investment in terms of our regions. Mayoral strategic authorities are now increasingly so the conduit that brings together local authorities, local aspirations, but bridging the gap to national partners and operators as well. Really excited to be here today to kind of talk around some of the work that we're doing in the North East, but also learning from others and best practice elsewhere. As Neil's kind of said there, Northumberland line, very proud of that project on our patch. We really want to take a lot of the lessons learned and go on to deliver more in the region and help connect communities up by rail, but also achieving those wider economic benefits and social benefits, which these schemes need to be increasingly seen as, not transport for transport's sake, but how can we realise the goals and ambitions of ourselves as a mayoral strategic authority and capture that in terms of projects as well, so unlocking housing, connecting people to jobs and the like. Mayoral strategic authorities increasingly are working across boundaries, so we're working with partners, as I say, our national partners, but also colleagues across the board in terms of our colleagues elsewhere as well, in Tees and Yorks as well. So we've got a lot of opportunities to work with local partners and bring these schemes together, but really excited to kind of talk around some of our projects. For me personally, the Leamside line, and I'll be plugging that a lot today, but our kind of flagship project, rail project in the North East, really looking at how we can bring back, reinstate a new railway line to reinstate the Leamside line and reconnect communities in County Durham and Sunderland, but also have wider operational benefits in terms of relieving capacity on the East Coast Main Line. We really see this as a multi-kind of benefit scheme, and I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more as we talk around benefits around the scheme. So yes, so Mayoral Strategic Authority is very much an emerging kid on the block, but happy to talk about our increasing role in bringing together partners in terms of working on business cases, and very excited to learn from my colleagues today around how these kind of business cases can work going forward and our increasing role in terms of working with national partners. That's on.
Good morning still. Matt Barnes, Head of Strategic Service Development for Great Western. I lead all long-term service development, so long-term timetable, infrastructure schemes, particularly reopenings, new stations, also rolling stock strategy. A long background in reopening. I was the led from sort of cradle to grave the Dartmoor line reopening for Great Western, but also jointly for the industry with my colleague Christian from Network Rail. And as such, I'm always happy to talk all day about reopening schemes, because from a professional railway perspective, there is nothing more satisfying than seeing the impact it has on people in the community and being validated that all the effort that's gone into persuading people in Whitehall that what we say is real, seeing that actually proved right is very satisfying. And some of you in the room have heard me talk like this before at other sessions. My history with reopening schemes includes obviously the Dartmoor line, where I wrote the business case as well as leading the kind of ops delivery side and really owning the whole vision behind it. But all the stuff in Bristol, so Portishead is part of a bigger programme, Bristol Metro West. You mentioned Brabazon, and other schemes which are not reopening schemes around down on the Newquay branch, which is live at the moment, and also future reopening schemes like Tavistock. I'm also the Great Western Interlink for East West Rail, so part of the industry sort of integration steering group for that. But before I joined Great Western, I used to work for Devon County Council, so I have a background in transport planning and business cases, and that is really, really key because the railway, traditionally doesn't look outside its boundary fence, but when you're making a case for something, you've got to have vision, you've got to build a coalition of the willing, and you've got to really, really understand the case for change and what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to sell. And that starts with the impact you have on the community.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt. Matthew.
Thank you. Yes, I'm another Matt. Matthew Reinberg. I'm a lead sponsor in the investment planning part of Transport for London. And for the last few years, I've been leading the development of the West London Orbital project, which is a new London Overground route running from Hounslow to Hendon, 11 miles across West and North London. And you might ask, sort of, why is that a railway reopening? It does cover a mixture of existing routes served by existing passenger services, but also 2 sections of disused line. One of them, the Dudding Hill line, which last saw a passenger service in 1902, and still has semaphore signalling, and which is pretty rare in London these days. So the scheme has 12 stations, 4 new stations, and it's a real kind of multidisciplinary rail engineering challenge with signalling, electrification, new stabling, and so on. In terms of why we're doing it, it's a bit like colleagues have said, really. Whilst a lot of London is obviously better connected than most places around the country, but there is still big pockets of deprivation. There's still, whilst a lot of these places have radial links to central London, the communities aren't connected along the route, the businesses aren't connected on the route. So economically, these places are missing out because business productivity isn't as high as it could be, but also people don't have access to jobs where they could, access to education. So there is still a real sort of big case around it in that respect. And we hope to move it forward to deliver it in the coming years.
Thank you, Matthew. And it's, really good to have that London perspective in there, as you say, places like Hounslow, not, that multiple what do you call it, indicators of deprivation, lots of them are in there. And, London, people often assume all the wealth is down there. It really isn't. South East London, the impact of the overground there, fantastic. A lot of these places obviously had light rail links that were cut off, and so that's really good to have your perspective on this session. And indeed, as Matt Barnes has articulated, the overground-like elements which are involved in the Brabazon line and how Bristol and the West of England is going to be quite London style in that respect. It's great to have that connected on this session. So if we can get first of all into the wider, the non-railway benefits, if you like, I think this is something which has come through really strongly in the West of England, but also talking to Matt in advance of this session about the Dartmoor line, it seems that it almost wouldn't have happened without the involvement of those local stakeholders. And they therefore believe in the railway as bringing wider benefits. Of course, we know the environmental benefits, but can you tell a bit more about what it's done to the community in Oakhampton and around Dartmoor?
Well, I think fundamentally railways are about connecting people to places, and it's about opening up opportunities. And when we were making the case for the Dartmoor line, it was about demonstrating that there was one genuinely a problem, social isolation in particular, peripherality, but that the railway would actually create those opportunities, address that. And what we have seen is that has proved true. So we saw very quickly businesses highlighting the impact it was on visitor numbers to the town. But in particular, it's opened up opportunities to access education, leisure and skills. So one of the things we put in the business case was the evidence that showed the extent to which the area to the west of Oakhampton. Oakhampton serves a big rural area which the local community described as a railway desert. And Oakhampton, an existing freight line, was an oasis in that railway desert. And what it's done is it's allowed far more people to access skills in Exeter. So Exeter College is the main centre of further education, or 16, 17 education, I should say, in Devon. and you've seen this great increase in people able to access that. There are, of course, some disbenefits. You know, you change people's patterns, then that impacts things. It's impacted sixth form provision in the town of Okehampton. But we've seen that. And the other thing we've seen, just from a purely railway perspective, is the usage of the line includes more long-distance travel than we forecast in the business case. And that is reflective of the fact that railways, you know, when we're doing business cases, we often think of them as people are doing that today, so they'll do that in future. But actually, railways generate demand. They bring people in who wouldn't have otherwise gone there. And we've seen that directly in the much higher yields that we see on rail fares, because we see more long-distance journeys coming. And, of course, they're spending money in the town and accessing the wider area because, as I say, the whole of West Devon and North Cornwall benefits from that kind of oasis effect.
So, Neil, perhaps if you could follow on from that and talk about what's happened in Northumberland. I mean, I really felt on Tuesday afternoon the ridership is about double what it was. And again, going back to that business case thing, you don't anticipate all the trip generators and the use cases. So actually now they're making the case on the Northumberland line for expanding capacity, you know, 2 sets of 3-car trains rather than 2 cars, etc. Can you talk a bit more about the people who are using the line?
Yeah, certainly. So as far as demand's concerned, certainly business cases never overstate demand. So it shouldn't really be a surprise that when you open a railway that you get more people using the railway and travelling from A to B to C to D than the business case predicted. So certainly demand on the Northumberland line is about 30% higher than the business case predictions. So a lot of people say, well, that's a nice problem to have. It is if you've got all the train crew and rolling stock available to put on additional services, which of course that's a massive issue in the UK, as everybody is aware of, I'm sure. So it does provide us challenges. We only built out half of the car parks at 3 of the locations, half the capacity of the car parks at 3 of the locations, because we were tracking the demand predictions in the business case, which suggested we wouldn't get the demand levels until around 2032. Well, of course, at Newsham Station and Seaton Delaval stations, when we opened them, the car parks were full from day one, so now there's a car park expansion scheme in play. So what seemed to be good decisions at the time have turned out to be bad decisions with the benefit of hindsight, and it is all because, to coin the phrase, build it and they will come, they absolutely do. And people are starting to use, make journeys that were never made before. So they would never make some of those journeys on the bus network, which they now make on the train. So putting the cases on the train and going on holiday, people wouldn't necessarily do that if they were having the first bit of the journey was on a bus, for example. So we're seeing a lot of that demand. But it's not all about taking people from Ashington and the stations in between there and Newcastle, taking them people into Newcastle. So it's not a one-way street, the Northumberland line. We've also seen journeys, increasing journeys made the other way. People coming up the line into Northumberland, especially in towards the coastal regions where, one of the stations, Newsham's, only a kilometre from the coast. Nice beach there, nice facilities. So why wouldn't you jump on there with the family and take the bucket and spade? So that we're seeing that certainly in the summer months as well. So it is unlocking an awful lot of leisure journeys, but there's a huge amount of students travel there from down the line at the Newcastle College now. So probably about a third to a half of the people getting off some of the peak trains in the morning all have the Newcastle College lanyards on. And again, it's about connecting people to education, connecting people to jobs, and we're seeing that really unfold, and that is a reality. We've had to strengthen services, so Northern Trains have had to strengthen services, certainly peak trains in the morning. That's purely to cope with the demand they're seeing in those peak trains. Saturdays and Sundays, word to the wise, we started with an hourly service on a Sunday. Don't do that, because if you're building a new line, it needs to be, it's the same level of services you're putting on Monday through to Saturday, because every train on a Sunday has to be strengthened, because there's an awful lot of leisure journeys on a Sunday which were never predicted. So it's a bit of a word to the wise. So just before I leave and pass on, haven't mentioned housing. So one of the things that it has unlocked the stations is 14,000 new homes around the station locations in what we class as the economic corridor around the Northumberland line, and that is clear that a lot of those houses are unlocked because there's an alternative way of getting from A to B other than putting cars on an already congested road network. So that is a real benefit that we're seeing unfold now with lots of planned applications coming to the fore.
That's great, Neil. Thank you. And I think the housing is an absolutely key piece of the jigsaw. If you go from northeast coast to northwest coast, I don't know how many people in this room know this fact, but I've been surprised to discover how many kind of major policymakers and politicians don't. And I've ended up calling it the Blackpool parable, for want of a better phrase. Danny Williams thinks parable's not the right term, but whatever, you know. So, did you know that Blackpool used to have the busiest railway station in the world? Yeah, nodding heads. I mean, some people in rail know that. A lot of policymakers don't. And the punchline is, it's now a multi-storey car park. So that's Blackpool Central, as was. At time, of course, but that was 1911. You know, we didn't have cheap flights. Lifestyles were different. There was a lot more wealth in the north, particularly Liverpool, all across the north, Scarborough, all of that. And everyone went on holiday in Blackpool. And Blackpool's a great place. I spend a lot of time there, really care about it. I think it's brilliant. And housing, there's some controversy about housing plans in Blackpool, the way it's being done. But I mean, I think what this says is that rail connectivity is key. And there's, you know, we'll maybe if we have the chance today, come on to cases like there is for the Poulton Fleetwood link, the north of Blackpool, I think would be really fantastic if that can be got through. There's another piece of that jigsaw, which is integrated transport. There were direct trains that went to Fleetwood Station and then integrated onto Maritime, onto Ireland and Scotland, of course. So from our point of view, I think if the success of the North East can be reflected in the North West, I think that would be a great thing. And on that note, I'd love to get onto, if we may, the devolution piece and the combined authority's role in this, Ben. So, of course, you know, as GBR is rolling forwards, there's a big sort of question about how the intercities interact, or the islands and the bridges, if you like, the intercities interact with mayoral strategic authorities, especially when operators cross boundaries. How's the B network rail going to look? How is North East rail going to look, etc., and indeed North West. So, Ben, could you speak a bit more about what your hopes are with the strategic authority in the North East and how that regional rail piece can work? And as part of that, you could be looking at the Leamside line and really making the case stronger for the Leamside line.
I think exactly that. So yeah, that's a fantastic point. And we have a fantastic opportunity with devolution to really kind of think about what we want rail to do for the region. Because we are locally based, we are have our kind of feelers, not just in transport, but across economic development. We have teams working on child poverty, a child poverty action plan for the region, skills and the like, so we can really think about and get a clear kind of steer around what do we want rail investment to unlock in the region, how can we lever that in, and really kind of on the aspect of why rail. So you mentioned the Leamside line and the like, and Neil's kind of touched on it there in terms of those wider, that increasingly looking at these schemes from a corridor perspective. So how do we develop up an investment corridor approach to really look at these proposals for not just as isolation, transport schemes in isolation, but really around what does it enable in terms of access to opportunity, or it connects, this part of the proposal connects this part of the community with colleges, apprenticeship opportunities, and I think this is really the difficulty point, and how do we, coming back to the actual subject of the panel about business cases and railway reopenings, how do you really articulate that in the early stages of a business case? I think it's really difficult to really, as you say, like as projects develop, the kind of demand picture changes. I think that's a really interesting challenge in terms of how do we kind of capture those benefits. But I think we're a better place than ever, really, because we're being based locally, having that local evidence base, being more connected in terms of the communities and being a bit more of a conduit, rather than these cases being built up nationally. We can really draw on a local evidence base in terms of really drawing up the evidence for that. In terms of a wider devolution point, I think we're still in a space where we're working through exactly what we want that picture to look like. We obviously look across the our Transpennine borders to Manchester and Liverpool and look at what the success of the B network, and there's definitely that aspiration there of what level of devolution can create that benefit. How can we work with the industry to get those benefits? I think there's an element of co-design there in terms of collaboration and the like, so without taking that risk on, as it were, in terms of station ownership and the like, and the difficulties that can have. But I think we need to still work out that picture really in terms of what can devolution, what are the opportunities really that devolution sets out for us. And I think it's exciting. I think there's an element of like local knowledge in terms of really kind of knowing that evidence base. But I think we're still on that journey really in terms of really working out what the opportunities are, where the opportunities, where can we lever in industry knowledge, as it were. So we're really on that journey, as it were. So yeah, I think we're really well placed. I think it's increasingly just articulating that these devolution gives us the power to kind of demonstrate the wider narrative of this regional narrative in terms of this can connect X, Y, and Z. It can connect this community and really generating that from not just a isolationary transport point of view, but it's all those wider economic benefits. And we're hearing that increasingly from colleagues at the Department of Transport is how do we articulate that in the business case? And we're going to really need to do that to make stuff like our flagship projects like Leamside stack up to really kind of articulate what are the wider economic benefits of this. And placemaking business cases will hopefully help us do that going forward.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. And it's great to see, I mean, the progress of the devolution agenda in many respects, including there's a consultation open now for the signing off for Transport Works Act orders, which will be a really, really good thing if that's enabled, so that, you know, the right people are saying the right things about devolution on transport. Fiscal devolution is a big piece of that, and London for a long time, of course, has been able to raise and retain and reinvest its own revenue, and also managed to avoid bus deregulation back in the day. So, Matthew, could you speak a bit more, I mean, following on from Ben's point about how that integrated regional transport authority can help with, particularly with rail reopenings, and you know, speaking to the point about West London Orbital perhaps, but really also about the what TfL enables and how Necker and others might be able to hop on board.
Yeah, I think one authority having control of all the different types of transport in a city is very or a region is very beneficial, because you can do that joined up planning. You can work out, for example, if we introduce West London Orbital, we would reconfigure the bus network, because you don't need competing parallel bus services. You actually need the services to reconfigure to feed into the stations. You can also make sure the active travel links are there, so people can cycle and walk to the stations and do their journeys overall in the best way. So having that all joined up is definitely beneficial, and that's on West London Orbital, very much sort of talking about the vision that was mentioned earlier and looking at the kind of non-transport side of it as well. We're now looking at it as a kind of a corridor, basically a growth corridor, which needs a spatial vision that's really compelling, that not only the Mayor and TfL, but also the local boroughs who are also part of the government mix in London, and that case can be really compelling to the government as well, so it all fits with the national policy too. And by covering not just purely the transport case, but looking at that vision for the corridor, I think that's how these schemes can get off the ground. Because otherwise, if you're purely talking about transport and not linking it up to everything else, then I guess if I was a government minister, I'd be sort of saying, well, how is that actually delivering what the country needs? So, and the final point, I guess, on the financial devolution as well, or fiscal devolution, it's very hard these days to put together a funding package for a scheme that might cost hundreds of millions of pounds. With no one has the money like they used to, whether that's the government, whether that's TfL, whether that's local boroughs. So having the powers to be able to make more informed choices about where investment goes locally can make a big difference there. And you can sort of put two and two together, I guess, that investing in transport might actually reduce the money you need for healthcare if people are able to get out more and access, cultural venues or whatever. You can make those decisions more rationally when those measures are in place.
That's the thing. Thanks very much. And I mean, nobody likes tax. You know,
Yeah.
it's a tricky thing. And the UK is notoriously a low-tax country. But what's interesting about London is you've got various levies that all feed in, and they're from TfL that feed straight back into investing in transport, and nobody minds. And therefore you've got also a mode share target of 80%, which people can work towards, and people have all the options. They've all got all the modes available. And in the UK we're not very good at that, right? So Nottingham has a workplace parking levy, which has had the carrot of the tram and the stick of the levy, but that's worked, and now Nottingham feels like feels like Leon or somewhere. It feels like you're in Europe when you're in Nottingham. It's amazing. And so it's tricky, because we've got these continental examples. You've got France, they've got this versement transport, so every region of over 100,000 people has a ring-fenced hypothecated levy which goes straight into transport, and we're not there. We're not probably going to get the UK to be sort of a federalist situation anytime soon, but if we can get somewhere further through devolution, as is happening, and actually using the overnight visitor levy, other things like this, and saying, well, look, do you know what? If you can show to your regions that actually you're going to get a tram, you're going to get a local rail line, you're going to get integrated transport, reduce your cost to the NHS, have a better quality of life fundamentally. And that point's really important, I think. Whenever I go to Nottingham, like I say, just you feel healthier, you feel happier. It's amazing. And that's happened in a short space of time, thanks to that local revenue raising, actually. So, all that we can do to really make the case for that would be really helpful. So, Matt, I'd like to come to you to be the celebrity here, if you like, and show us how it's done. So, the key question really for this session is, what are the hoops that we need to jump through to get these reopenings over the line? And I think everyone here would really like to know how you did what you did with the Dartmoor line.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back to my vision, coalition, the willing, and then into the business case piece. So the vision is about really understanding what you're trying to achieve and what difference that is going to make. And that includes what it's going to do in terms of unlocking housing, jobs, etc., and addressing the kind of opportunity, how it creates opportunity. Because that is the heart of what you're going to communicate as to why we should do something. Remembering that in the end, everything we do on a business case is to let a bunch of people put their signatures to something, but whether it goes ahead or not is a political choice. So you can have the best business case in the world, but it's a political choice, and that feeds into the coalition, the winning piece. So if you've got a really compelling vision and everyone's completely aligned, then it's a hell of a lot easier. In fact, you just won't get money from politically if you don't have that vision and that alignment. But the hoops, fundamentally, there are technical hoops to develop a scheme, but ultimately that all builds into the hoops, which are the decision-making hoops. How do you get business cases approved, which means the financial element? So how are you going to get the funding? How are you going to assemble that? And we've heard that is rarely possible to come from one source nowadays. That tends to involve multiple sources. On the Dartmoor line, although it was during your railway, not many people know that there was quite a bit of money put in through Great Western, still Department of Transport money, to enable the development and get going ahead of our entry into the governance structures through the Rail Network Enhancement Pipeline to draw down the capital funding. But most schemes involve, we've heard mayoral strategic authorities, substantial local funding to get the thing going. OPEX and revenue, these are absolutely key, because now that we are, historically franchising gave the bite of the cherry to kind of make decisions in the round. Nowadays, any investment choice is taken as a standalone cost impact on the kind of profit and loss account of what will be Great British Railways, but at the moment is effectively a budget for an operator into a DfT budget. So if you can't show how you're going to fund the CapEx and that the revenue is going to offset the OPEX, or that you've got a way to get close to that and some subsidy to get going, it's very, very difficult to get there. And then you've got the final component, which is no one's going to fund a scheme which has a BCR of 0.01. They might fund a scheme, Borders Railway, for example, was not even quite 1, but where they can see clearly the evidence is it will exceed its forecast and its real value will be far higher. But the ability to get your officially, Green Book's been changed to focus less on BCRs, but it's still really important to be able to demonstrate that your socio-economic case is strong. And that, traditionally, within the railway, we're not very good at capturing the kind of non-rail bit, so we focus a lot on the OPEX, the CapEx, and the revenue. But actually, the case for most transport schemes is what does it do in terms of taking cars off the road? And linked back to that vision piece, what does it do in terms of unlocking houses? If you haven't got through the local plan any evidence that housing is dependent, then your ability to demonstrate that there's any actual economic value in unlocking those houses is basically just doesn't go in the business case. If you can show the housing is dependent, then all of a sudden you get land value uplift in there. And then the final point of that is modal shift. So the railway has a way of capturing modal shift value through something called marginal external costs. But it massively underplays it against having a highway model which you can put your change in traffic volumes, which can take account of the impact of future congestion levels relating from population growth, can take account of the locally specific population growth rather than kind of national level assumptions. So that is why it's really very difficult for any one organisation to do it. You, as well as a political coalition willing, you actually need at a technical level, Mayoral strategic authorities are going to be best placed to capture that impact on local plans and on the road network. The railway is best placed to try and drive down the OPEX, come with the most efficient solution possible. We were lucky with Dartmoor; it's a very efficient scheme, and work out the art of the possible of how you can do it and how you can prove you can make it successful. Because Dartmoor, we had actually very ambitious numbers. The real secret was how we proved. And one thing that we did, believe it or not, I think there was probably a few people in Treasury who fell off their chairs when we quoted this, but in October 2020, we demonstrated that we'd already returned to 70% of pre-COVID usage of the railway in Exeter. And that was critical. But of course, for the most part, just whatever way it is, proving that it's real, these people will turn up is key.
Fantastic. Well, what an inspiring way, I think, to finish our discussion here. Thank you so much. What a brilliant discussion. We've got some time to open up for questions. So, yes, gentlemen over there. Is there a microphone around? Sorry, to give you a warning. Have a think of your questions if you've got other questions. There's a gentleman just over there. Yeah, thank you.
Hi there, my name's Matt. I maintain signals for Network Rail in the southwest. I've lived between Cornwall and Devon my whole life, mainly Plymouth. For most of my life, we've heard about the Tavistock reopening. It keeps happening, then not happening, not happening. So I think my question remains to Matt Barnes is that scheme going to go ahead at some point? And third to that, are other branch lines, say the Foy and Bobbin and Cornwall, will they get reopened in the future? Is that something Great Western's looking at?
I feel like I've got a plant here, because it's almost like I've asked him to ask this question. So Tavistock, so equally close to my heart to the Dartmoor line. I've been involved in Tavistock for 17 years. We've come quite close a couple of times. There is actually £11.5 million of developer contributions, Section 106, already secured. We had an SABC approved and £1.5 million of development funding out of our way are also secured. And then Rishi Sunak very unhelpfully chose to call an election and everything, went up in smoke. But in reality, it still exists as a scheme. It's part of what's called Plymouth Metro. So Plymouth Metro has pivoted from just a reopening into a scheme which is equally about, similar about creating opportunity. Within Plymouth, you have Devonport Dockyard, maintains a strategic deterrent in the sense that it maintains all of our nuclear submarines, it refits them, and it has to decommission them. And it's going through a massive programme of investment and increasing the number of jobs there by thousands. The railway goes right past it, has multiple stations, but it's poorly served. So Tavistock is a component of a scheme which would introduce local train services into Plymouth. And we're designing that scheme so that Tavistock becomes a very efficient bolt-on. You'll be aware re-signalling is coming up in Plymouth. Re-signalling in Plymouth is providing passive provision for Tavistock. And actually, we are looking at potentially, as part of that Plymouth Metro concept, even more active provision in the sense that if we did introduce more local train services, some of them would actually effectively terminate at Beerleston and shunt out the way on the signalling that would be there ready for Tavistock. So it is definitely not dead, but these things are about trying to create the opportunities and then seizing the moment. And we had an opportunity, the ship sailed, we pivoted into another place. Foy is really difficult and Bodmin are difficult. They're very different. Bodmin General, of course, you've got the Heritage Railway. There has been study work on in the past, but it's not really going anywhere at the moment. And Foy, of course, as long as Calm Point's there, it's just not really practical because you're the wrong side of, that major clay terminal.
Thank you, Matt. Gentleman at the front here.
Thank you. Keith Holm, Transport Planning. Talking about the business case and the BCR, and I think it's good that the Green Book encourages you to look at a wider benefits and not just the narrow transport ones. But there is a tendency to forget that the other side of the benefit-cost ratio is the cost. And my anecdotal observation is the cost of building railway stations has increased far, far quicker than general construction industry cost inflation, not just retail price index. I tend to work on housing developments these days, so what the chap said about unlocking housing development was interesting. But you look at the cost of building a railway station, 2 platforms, you may be 240 metres long or something like that, basic bridge lift, and it's far greater than, for example, some of the developments. I don't plan these developments, but where you're looking at a 6th form entry secondary school, fully equipped with science labs, kitchens, playing fields, everything, and that's cheaper than building 1 2-platform station. I just wonder what is the industry doing about addressing the cost aspect. We can't get back to the old West Yorkshire days of 2 wooden platforms costing 100 grand. Those days have long gone, obviously, with disabled access, equalities requirements and so on. But I just think what's happening to railway industry costs for basic railway stations, not complex ones like Reading rebuild, but just, or even the one near Chelmsford with 4 platforms and all that track slewing. Obviously, that's going to be costly. But just your basic, your Kenilworths or things like that, they just seem to have gone astronomical. And that's what's killing schemes' viability. Yeah, it's a really important question. I'm glad you raised it. Thank you. I think someone a few years ago said it was 15 million was a standard for a 2-platform. It's like Network Rail flatback kind of. And that doesn't seem like much now, 15 million, So it's right. So Brent Cross West, 60, it's mind-blowing. It's a really important question. There's lots of sort of speculation and justification for why that might be the case. But I think it's crucial we get to the bottom of it for all of us to make the case for this investment. There's an issue at the moment with White Rose, all sorts of sort of case studies. Neil, can I pass it on to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing to say is 6 stations on the Northumberland line, about 3/4 of the cost of the station in the car parks was in the ground. So it's often around the location that you're building the stations, because if you went for the station location with the best ground conditions, it wouldn't be the best location for exploiting all of the housing developments, the businesses, the industry that you're looking to create around the stations. So invariably, certainly the case on the Northumberland line, we were building stations in areas where the ground conditions was driving a huge amount of the cost. So Northumberland Park, for example, we spent £7 million pumping grout into old main shafts and main workings under the station. When I first joined the programme, I said we need to move that 150 metres further south. But that doesn't have all the connectivity that, and you probably would have bumped into, other challenges 150 metres further south. So it really is about what's in the ground, and the station locations are often, and rightly so, dictated by, the best connectivity, the best way of exploiting the benefits and maximising the benefits against the cost of that scheme. So I totally agree. If you compare, constructing housing estates and other commercial developments with the cost of railway stations, it does look disproportionately high. I agree. And then you get down into the detail and you look at sort of ground conditions and building Seaton Delaval in a floodplain with great crested newts. You look at all of that and you go, okay, I can start to understand how the cost of these particular stations increases. But in terms of solving that, I don't think you can solve the location very easily because of all the things I've just said. But certainly in terms of initiatives of driving the cost down, one of the big initiatives we didn't exploit enough on Northumberland, to be honest, and it was too late in the day when we really tried hard at this, but reusing the material that you have on site. Everything that comes out of the ground. So if you're building a car park and you need to go down 2 metres into the ground and start building up the layers because you're effectively building it on a swamp, right? All of that material coming out of the ground is either hazardous or contaminated. I guarantee nothing's going to be inert anymore. So as soon as you're not dealing with inert material to dispose of, your cost of disposing of that goes through the roof. So reusing as much material on site as possible, setting up, materials treatment plants. You might think, well, that's a 7-figure sum. Well, actually, that might still save you some money at the end of the day, because and it's the right thing to do from a sustainability perspective as well. So that's just one of the initiatives I think industry and designers, especially if there's any designers in the room, need to try harder at, because designers like the safe option of saying, we'll just import a load of stone because that behaves in a way that we can control, we're comfortable with it. If we reuse the materials on site, we're not as comfortable with that, but actually get outside the comfort zone at the design stage, start reusing materials, setting your contractors up to do that, and I think you can start saving some big money in the ground for these station projects.
Thank you, Neil. That's a really important point. There was we had an on-train guide on our trip on the Settle Carlisle line on Tuesday morning, who made the slightly cheeky point that Settle Carlisle reused absolutely everything on site. It was a completely sort of net zero in terms of carbon project, and he had made a cheeky dig at HS2, who HS2 should be completed in full all the way to Leeds and Manchester, absolutely, and down to France. But he'd made a cheeky dig that a lot of stuff is being shipped in, and as much as we can follow that approach, I think the better off we'll be. Well, look, thank you all for an absolutely fantastic discussion. Thank you for your questions, for joining us today. I think it's been a really rich discussion this morning. Some things that have come through. We know that reopenings always work, and they go beyond the success that's predicted in business cases. The ridership is always way beyond that. The impact they have on local communities is immense. The impact they have on quality of life, on mode shift, on everything. It's always worth supporting it. So we're all here together really today to support the case for reopenings. Of course, taking into account the fact that costs, where possible, need to come down by such means as reusing materials locally. We've heard that it's useful to have a coalition of the willing regionally to get success over the line. How do we get those schemes, those hoops jumped through successfully? You need to engage the local stakeholders, of course, beyond just rail. That's really key. Have political champions who've got conviction. That happened I know it's not heavy rail, but that happened in Nottingham over there. There was a 100 club in Nottingham who met regularly, and they really got behind that scheme. So the willing team was there already. And the final thing, I'd say that we've got examples that show success, right? We've talked about, obviously, Northumberland line, Portishead coming down the line. We want to get behind West London Orbital. We want to get behind the Leamside line. Those lines, let's all look at those prospects out there and say Port and Fleetwood as well, for example, Colne Valley, those key opportunities at the moment. If we address the cost element as well, and that helps the case fundamentally, let's get behind those schemes that are lined up and actually use the examples of success we have today to see further success in the future and then reap the benefits across the country. Thank you very much for joining today.